discuss a vital issue of concern. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Alliance is a multi-year initiative that began with a major summit in 2019 at Douglas, at Rutgers, from which emerged our structure and our priority on supporting co-curricular efforts to advance underrepresented women in STEM. Our mission is to promote collaboration between Big Ten schools on methods to disrupt the systematic underrepresentation of women in STEM. At the same time, our goal is to create a community of practice across Big Ten institutions for mutual support, shared practices, and new partnerships. And by this we mean we want to sort of shatter the silos among our Big Ten institutions. So that's very much what we've been working on and where we've seen great success. While we meet in smaller working groups, one on supporting the infrastructure and broad programs of the Alliance, one to develop common data sets across the Alliance for analysis and comparison, and one to develop common programs possibly across the Big Ten. We also develop these conferences as a service to the broad Big Ten community. The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the National Science Foundation, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Rutgers have sponsored the summit and our subsequent work. We welcome participation in the project by each of you, so please be sure to contact me or any of the conveners of the program today if you want to jump on board. There's lots, it's a lot of fun, actually, great connections, great new friendships, and we welcome all of you. So today we take another important step, analyzing how the unprecedented nature of our current circumstance affects our students. A great deal of attention in the press has been given to the negative impact of the pandemic on the careers of women STEM faculty, particularly those of color. Failure to respond quickly and adequately will jeopardize years of progress toward faculty equity. So this is an imperative that we've heard a lot about and that we all hope our universities are working on. Now, on the student side, there's not a lot of research yet on the impact of students, and that's coming. And you'll hear about some of the groundbreaking research today. But let me just say that an NSF study found in June that nearly 10% of STEM students had not decided or would not enroll in fall 2020 due to the pandemic. And this is particularly relevant to us. Almost 13% of Hispanic and 10% of Black students reported delaying their graduation, whereas only 6% of Asians and whites did. Among STEM students, according to this study, the top two learning challenges in transitioning to remote learning were difficulty focusing on remote instruction and activities, and difficulty with personal motivation to complete coursework. And compared with their male peers, female students, women students generally reported more learning challenges in transitioning to remote learning. And I can pop the citation for this study into the chat. Our job today is to dig deeper into the impact of COVID and remote learning, and to discuss how we as leaders of co-curricular programming can intervene in the probable loss of academic progress among our students for those who did not return, and to begin ascertaining if the students who have returned have lost gains in academic progress, and also to address the challenges and opportunities for those students, the other challenges and opportunities for those students who are in school. We need much more research on these topics. And from our convening group, we all did some research on this. We see the next 6 to 12 months as really vital for the publication of research on the impact on our students. There's in the pipeline, we don't see a great deal of research on students of color. So I do see that as a gap, but you know, we don't know everything that's going on, and it's certainly something we can discuss. So by taking this preliminary step today, we hope to energize a collective conversation that will lead to best practice interventions to mitigate what we see, what we determine as the effects of the current moment. So at this point, to introduce the exciting program, I want to turn the mic, so to speak, over to Gio Guerra Perez, who is also the lead for the group that put this conference together. She is the Executive Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and she will introduce the day's events. Thank you, and Gio, over to you.
Good morning, buenos dias, and thank you, Jackie, for your opening remarks. And also, I want to thank the Rutgers team, as well as my colleagues across the Big Ten for their extraordinary support in helping us to organize this event. As Jackie mentioned, I'm Gioconda Guerra Perez. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and member of the steering committee of the Big Ten Academic Alliance Advancing Women in STEM working group. Today, since I welcome you from Urbana-Champaign, I would like to begin by recognizing that we are, as a land-grant institution, we have the responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which this institution exists. I will begin this event with the following statement. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Miskutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. During the course of the last few months, our team debated about what we should do to help our institutions and colleagues to understand and learn how COVID-19 has affected undergraduate students in STEM, particularly women of color. And also, the pandemic has directed a new light on the persistent and insidious twin crisis of systemic racism and generational embedded racial disparities afflicting our society. So we hope that throughout the day, we can provide some insight on how these issues are affecting our students, particularly women of color, how COVID and the systems of inequality are disproportionately affecting undergraduate students because of either gender, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. Important to indicate that you will have the opportunity to ask questions, engage in critical conversations, take what you learned today and share it with your colleagues in your campus. During the morning, we will begin our program with our keynote speaker, Dr. Tamara Pearson. Second, we will have our distinguished research panel that will discuss the effect of COVID-19 on undergraduate students in STEM, particularly the impact on underrepresented students. For the afternoon sessions, a panel of undergraduate students who will share their experience during COVID-19, followed by our program highlights for women in STEM during COVID. And we will conclude with a networking session where we will be able to meet in small groups and to share ideas and experiences. Thank you for joining us today in this much needed conversation. But before I turn the mic over to my colleague, Sheila Kraft Morgan, who will introduce our keynote speaker, we ask that you should direct your questions to the Q&A function in the Zoom. Now, Sheila Kraft Morgan.
Good morning. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Tamara Pearson. Dr. Pearson is the inaugural director of the Center of Excellence for Minority Women in STEM at Spelman College, where she is focused on equipping, empowering, and elevating women of color in STEM. Prior to that, she served as Associate Director of School and Community Engagement at the Center for Education, Integrating Science, Mathematics, and Computing at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where her work focused on partnering with K-12 schools and districts to help develop innovative curriculum and programs, as well as understanding how to best engage populations historically marginalized in STEM fields. Dr. Pearson received a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Spelman College with a minor in Computer Science and an MED and PhD in Curriculum and Instruction with a specialization in Educational Technology from the University of Florida. Dr. Pearson.
Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So just make sure that this is good. Okay. So this is not the talk that I had planned to give. This is not the STEM talk that I normally give. But considering everything that has happened, it is the talk that I felt was needed today. So I ask as you listen on that you stay present, that you feel what you feel, but that you also be brave with those feelings. On the morning of Wednesday, January 6th, I woke up tired but hopeful. I live in Georgia, and you can probably guess my political leanings, and we had won the 2 Senate seats that the entire country was counting on us to win. Raphael Warnock, a Baptist minister and Morehouse graduate, would become the first Black senator to ever represent the state of Georgia. John Ossoff would become the first Jewish senator to ever represent the state of Georgia. We thought it was time to celebrate. After a year filled with one traumatic story after another, from a global health pandemic that has already killed over 2 million people worldwide, to thousands of people taking to the streets demanding justice and change for Black Americans, to an ugly political battle that left some joyful and others outraged, this seemed like the beginning of the 2021 that we all hoped for, the 2021 that we all needed, something that could bring us hope for a brighter tomorrow. But not quite. That afternoon, domestic terrorists stormed our nation's capital as millions of us looked on in confusion and horror. As I watched for hours, I felt disappointed and sad. If I am completely honest, I found myself actually hoping there would be mayhem. I was actually hoping there would be mass violence. I was actually hoping the situation would devolve into bloody chaos. As a Black woman in America, I am constantly reminded that I live in a country that does not value my life. A country that is run like our lives are chess pieces on a board. A country that is walking dangerously close to the edge of everything falling apart. I finally thought white men would experience the death and destruction my community faces anytime we have the audacity to ask for more. I wanted to be proven wrong. I wanted to be shown that it really is simply about law and order. I wanted my terrifying experience with the police to be simply a misunderstanding. See, every Black person I know has a story. That means whether you know it or not, every Black person you know has a story. This is mine. The summer after my freshman year, I interned at the Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York. Part of the reason I took that position was because I was a NASA undergraduate research scholar, which required that I conduct research every summer. The other, and if I'm being honest, more pressing reason, was because my boyfriend would also be out on Long Island that summer. He was a student at Morehouse. I was a student at Spelman. One evening, he was driving me home. We stopped at a convenience store to grab a soda before the rest of the trip. It had been a fun night. As we got in the car, we saw 5 police cars speeding into the parking lot. We looked around but didn't really pay it much attention until we realized that they were surrounding our car. They were there for us. They yelled at us to get out of the car. They separated us. As they questioned my boyfriend, they sat me on the sidewalk. They asked me how well I knew him. They asked me if I trusted him. They spoke to me as though they were the ones I should be trusting. They searched the car. They searched him. I sat there helpless, in shock. They thought we had robbed the fast food restaurant next door. He fit the description. After an hour of humiliation, they let us go. As we gathered ourselves and prepared to drive away, one of the officers pulled up beside us and said to my boyfriend, "You owe her a nice dinner for this." That was in 1993. I was 18 years old. I was lucky in a lot of ways. I was lucky that I made it to 18 without having experienced racial profiling by the police. I was lucky that on that night in Long Island, a cop wasn't scared by a movement made by me or my boyfriend. I was lucky that he and I didn't end up in jail. I was lucky that we didn't end up dead. I think about that night often. It has forever changed me. Every time I hear the story of a Black person being killed as they try to live their lives, I think about that night. I pray, and then I grieve. When I saw this video of the Spelman and Morehouse students being dragged from their cars, tased, and arrested, it all came flooding back. And I do warn you that this video can be upsetting.
It is a video that has been shared across social media. A pair of Atlanta college students tased and dragged from a car during protests Saturday night. It led the city to fire 2 Atlanta police officers, and criminal charges could still be coming. Today, those students spoke for the first time. 11 Alive's Andy Parati was there for that news conference. Andy, we learned a lot this afternoon.
Yeah, we sure did learn a lot from the couple and their attorneys, starting with the couple wasn't even involved with the protest. They were on their way home. Second, we learned that they are not quite ready to accept the mayor and the chief's apology. And Messiah Young, the young man driving, he suffered a fractured arm. Now, this all happened Saturday night, just after 9:30 near Centennial Olympic Park. Body camera video shows Messiah Young attempting to start recording cell phone video of someone screaming and on the ground under arrest. The officers then asked the Morehouse College student to drive away, then get out of the car. And then on the other side of the car, when they eventually stop, officers surround Young's passenger, his girlfriend, Tania Pilgrim, a Spelman College student. In seconds, police broke the driver's side window, slashed the tires, and officers Ivory Streeter and Mark Garner deployed their tasers, shocking both of them for 10 full seconds each. Less than 24 hours later, the mayor and the police chief apologized and announced they had fired 2 officers. The young woman who was shocked, the passenger, listened to what she had to say just moments ago.
This is the most traumatic thing that has ever happened, and I hope ever happens again in my life. I'm very shaken up. I don't even know how to act, what to do. I just can't stop thinking about if cameras weren't there, or if they would have went a little bit further. I can't stop thinking about what could have happened. Like, it's all that keeps crossing my mind.
Now, the police chief has recognized this does not help their ability to calm fears right now in the African-American community as it relates to police brutality. The district attorney office is investigating whether charges will follow for the 2 officers. The attorneys for the young couple say that they also want some sort of action involving 3 other officers who are now on desk duty. You're going to hear a lot more from them coming up tonight at 11. Back to you.
All right, Andy, thank you so much. Still an ongoing situation. If you missed any of that news conference, you can find it on our 11 Alive YouTube channel.
I don't tell you these stories to elicit guilt or pity. Your sympathy is not what I seek. I tell you this so that you can never say that you don't know anyone impacted by this disease we call racism. And the epidemic of racism is what was confirmed for me during last week's insurrection.
It is a video.
See, I finally thought white men would experience the death and destruction my community faces anytime we have the audacity to ask for more. But that didn't happen. Most of the insurgents were simply escorted out of the building and allowed to resume their visit to Washington, D.C., treated as though they were simply visitors who had strayed off the tour route. If I'm being honest, I was disappointed. If I'm being honest, I was sad. Why would I be sad and disappointed that the situation resolved peacefully? I want peace, right? My disappointment and sadness really has nothing to do with the events of that day. It is my need for retribution. It is my pain. It is my trauma. It is my work. It requires me to grapple with the darkness that often lays dormant, but when awakened can overwhelm me. But I am brave. The only way we as educators can create and effectively implement programs that truly address the needs of our Black students is if we understand and acknowledge their experiences. So where do we begin? We must challenge ourselves to have the uncomfortable and difficult conversations about solutions that are honest and implicate all of us. Today is the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And as he said so eloquently, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of convenience and comfort, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. You may be asking what this has to do with the development of programs focused on increasing the success of Black women in STEM. I say it is everything. When things fall apart, it shows us the cracks in our foundation. It shows us that our house is built on a shaky foundation. And until we address that foundation, all that we build upon it will continue to crumble. That's the secret sauce of places like Spelman College. It's a safe respite from all that Black women struggle with as members of this flawed society. When the Spelman team submitted their proposal to the Department of Defense for supporting the establishment of a Center of Excellence for Minority Women in STEM, they had a clear understanding of the purpose of the proposed center. They wanted to make sure that this center acknowledges Spelman's long history of excellence in educating Black women who become STEM leaders, a history that not only has led to Spelman College being ranked as the #1 HBCU in the country for the 14th year in a row, but one that keeps Spelman as the #1 baccalaureate institution for Black women who go on to receive PhDs in STEM. And this is not #1 among HBCUs, this is #1 in the country. A remarkable accomplishment, especially considering the small size of Spelman. However, they also didn't want to rest in that history. The goal of the center is to expand on that strong foundation as we strengthen and deepen the knowledge and experiences afforded to our students and faculty. Through close collaboration with and funding from the Department of Defense, we meet that goal of equipping, empowering, and elevating women of color in STEM with a current focus on 4 key components. Number 1, strengthening faculty and student research opportunities and engagement in emerging STEM fields through collaboration with higher education, industry, and government partners. Number 2, funding scholarships for students who show interest in pursuing graduate degrees in STEM, as well as potential for long-term success and leadership in STEM research careers. Number 3, hosting conversations showcasing cutting-edge interdisciplinary research being conducted by prominent women of color in STEM disciplines. And number 4, creating and disseminating promising practices for the preparation, advancement of minority women in STEM. And we are always guided in our work by our 3 pillars of excellence: research, academic advancement, and leadership and professional development. Although Spelman is currently completely virtual, we have been able to continue pressing forward in our work to support our students, faculty, and the community at large. We believe that this support is needed now more than ever. The first pillar is research. We know that a strong research foundation is the key to a successful career in STEM. The Department of Defense Research Scholars Program funds Spelman students as they embark on their research careers through partnerships with our faculty. As someone who conducted undergraduate research while a math major at Spelman, I understand the impact these experiences can have in helping our students better understand the possibilities available to them with a STEM degree. Next, each year the Center of Excellence invites a female STEM scholar at the top of her field to the Spelman campus as the Faulkner Scholar in Residence. Dr. Etta Faulkner was a visionary whose entire career was dedicated to the advancement of Black women in STEM. Dr. Faulkner was largely responsible for developing most of the departments in the Division of Natural Sciences and Mathematics at Spelman, and is recognized nationally for her contributions to the retention of underrepresented groups in the STEM disciplines, particularly in the mathematical sciences. She was also my advisor when I was at Spelman College. Named in her honor, the Faulkner Scholar in Residence is a female scholar of color who has shown a commitment to increasing gender and racial equity in STEM. Finally, in the research pillar, we understand that the strength of our students is a direct result of the knowledge and expertise of our faculty. Therefore, the Faculty Fellows Program gives natural sciences and mathematics faculty the opportunity to spend the summer at a Department of Defense affiliated lab engaged in collaborative research with a DoD scientist or engineer. And once these faculty members return to the Spelman campus, the expectation is that they will bring students into the research partnerships, potentially through funding as a research scholar. The second pillar is academic advancement, where we focus our attention on making sure our students have a strong academic foundation for graduate school and beyond, and that our faculty have what they need to support those students. Once again, we know that our students are only as strong as our faculty. Therefore, the emerging skills and technology workshops are developed in alignment with Department of Defense modernization priorities and Army essential research topics to enhance the capacity of our faculty in and out of the classroom. Whether through learning about new software in quantum science or new methodologies being used to make advancements in biotechnology, these workshops allow faculty to engage with experts to strengthen their skills. The hallmark of the academic advancement pillar is the Department of Defense Academic Scholars Program, a 4-year scholarship for students who show interest in and potential for earning advanced degrees in STEM. These are our current academic scholars. Many of our STEM students come to Spelman with aspirations of becoming medical doctors. The need for Black doctors is real and their aspirations are noble. We also want them to understand the critical need for Black women in STEM research. As vaccines are developed and new technologies are deployed, Black women must be at the table to ensure that our needs are met. This 4-year scholarship program not only financially supports the 20 brilliant women you see here, but it also equips them with the academic and social tools to successfully pursue their PhDs in STEM. During the fall semester, we met virtually every week with these lovely young ladies, not for the purpose of tutoring. They have an average GPA of 3.6. No, we met to maintain community, to allow them to share their challenges navigating this world as a Black woman, and to remind them that they are not alone. Included in those sessions are conversations about self-care and mental health, an area that Spelman has found to be a struggle for our students during this pandemic. The final pillar is leadership and professional development. We want to make sure that our faculty are able to think about and pursue their own professional development needs. As a former faculty member, I know it can be very challenging to find funding to attend conferences and workshops solely for the purpose of professional development. The Faculty Travel Awards are designed to assist with that challenge. Natural sciences and mathematics faculty can apply for funding to cover the cost of registration and other travel expenses associated with a professional development that meets their needs and is aligned with the priorities of the Department of Defense. In the spirit of sharing knowledge and building in the capacity of the entire division, we ask that faculty present a workshop on what they learned upon returning from the event. And finally, the Women in STEM Speaker Series brings Black women who are prominent in their field to engage with the Spelman community. And these are not your average public talks. Each invited guest is also asked to participate in small group conversations with our students and faculty to share the story of their personal journey to success. Events like this, where female STEM leaders of color take time to engage with our students on a personal level, are the moments that students remember. They are the moments that can change the course of a student's professional life. I still remember when I was a student at Spelman College, Dr. Mae Jemison came and spoke. It was the first time I had ever met a Black woman who was at the top of her field. It opened my eyes to the possibilities. Each year, the series will be around a selected theme. This year's theme, as expected, is COVID-19. We decided that we would have an opening keynote speaker followed by a panel. The opening keynote was delivered by Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, who I'm sure many of you know. She is the scientific lead at the National Institutes of Health, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases Vaccine Research Center. She has made a point of speaking as much as she can to encourage the Black community to take part in the vaccine trials, as well as the vaccine deployment. We followed that session with what we called Spelman on the Front Line. We wanted to showcase Spelman alumni who are actively engaged in disseminating and communicating about the COVID-19 virus. These 4 women engaged our community of over 150 people in a discussion about the needs of the Black community related to COVID-19. It was important to us that we elevate the voices of Black women in STEM because oftentimes we are silenced and made to feel invisible. Right after I graduated from Spelman College in 1996, I started a doctoral program in computer science with dreams of a career at Pixar Animation Studios, the powerhouse behind the world's first fully computer animated movie, Toy Story, which had been released the year before. I was one of 2 Black graduate students in the computer science department at the University of Florida, and the only one in the doctoral program. There were no Black faculty. I switched to another department, education, after 2 years, because the prospect of a lifetime of being the only one was more than I was ready to take on. Timnit Gebru is not me. Gebru represents one of the 1.5% of doctoral degrees in engineering held by Black women. She is one of the 1.6% of Google employees who are Black women, and one of the 0.9% of tech industry managers that are Black women. And for context, Black women comprise 7.7% of the population. Most importantly, she is highly respected as a groundbreaking researcher in AI ethics, which investigates the quality of the predictions made using artificial intelligence, as well as the ethical implications of those predictions on society. She specifically focuses on the impact of algorithmic bias on marginalized communities and unapologetically advocates for those communities. On December 2nd, 2020, Gebru tweeted that she had been fired from Google, setting off a backlash against the company. Although there is continued disagreement about whether Dr. Gebru was fired or resigned, one thing is clear. Her experience shines a light on an industry that struggles to retain Black women. Unfortunately, the low representation and horrific experiences of Black women in the tech industry is an example of challenges that exist across all STEM disciplines and throughout the entire STEM pipeline. As a STEM educator and researcher, I contend that Dr. Gebru's story not only fuels our work, but gives us critical information about how to move forward. What we are fighting against is about more than increased numbers. As Joy Buolamwini, founder of the Algorithmic Justice League and creator of the film Coded Bias, as well as a research collaborator of Timnit's, responded to Timnit's tweet with, to be bold, to be honest, to know your worth, to speak up for others, to do the thankless work, to pioneer the way, to suffer no fools, to be all they wish they could be, wrapped in Black womanhood, is an affront to those who would rather see us cower than own our own power. So where do we go from here? As I said before, the secret sauce of Spelman College and a large reason for the success of our programs is that we understand that the experiences of Black women are critical to who they are and how they move through the world. We see this identity as a strength, not something that makes us at risk. Because when you meet people where they are and affirm who they are, they will exceed your expectations. That's what we see at Spelman College, where 21.4% of our graduates are in the STEM disciplines, and where biology has now become the most popular major. As a Spelman alumna recently said to me when reflecting on her experience as a mathematics major at Spelman, I could just focus on the math. As many leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement has said, even during a pandemic, we don't get a break from systemic racism. Don't get me wrong, I know we all have good intentions. We are all trying to create a better future, but things are still falling apart. But if the sole proposed solution is a reliance on individual programs as opposed to systemic change, then the goal of equity is insincere. And we will always have an opportunity gap because we are putting the burden of democratizing STEM on communities who did not create the problem and do not have the power to solve it. So as you reflect on this talk and move back into your work, I implore you to ask yourself the following questions. How am I complicit in the inequities of our society? And is my program replicating or transforming our world? As Pema Chödrön tells us, things falling apart is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think that the point is to pass the test or to overcome the problem, but the truth is that things don't really get resolved. They come together and they fall apart. Then they come together again and fall apart again. It's just like that. Just like you, Spelman is trying to figure out what our center means in this current world that we live in. We are ever evolving and changing as the needs of our community and society at large change. Our hope is to become a hub for research, conversation, and advocacy for Black women in STEM. And I look forward to sharing our story with you as it unfolds. Thank you. I'll now take any questions that have come in the chat or in the Q&A.
Dr. Pearson, we don't have any questions right now, but perhaps you can go into a little bit more detail about how Spelman students have been affected personally by COVID-19. Have you heard any stories or?
Absolutely. I can actually talk about our academic scholars. So our academic scholars are all sophomores, which means that their freshman year of college was cut short by the pandemic, and they have not been back to campus since March of 2020. And one of the things, I have individual conversations with each of my scholars every semester, just to kind of check in with them on how they're doing and what they're struggling with. And a few things that have come up that I'm sure are not unique to Spelman College are, number one is feelings of isolation. Spelman is if you've ever been to Spelman, it's a very small campus. We are a very close-knit community, and our students really rely on each other and lean on each other for support. And so to not have that physical connection to the campus, to the community, has been a struggle for many of our students. In addition, as a historically Black college, many of our students see our campus as a safe space. It's almost like a refuge from the world that they live in. And so they feel as though when they are on our campus, they kind of can, to quote Terry McMillan, they're no longer waiting to exhale, right? They're able to let that breath out and truly be who they are without any judgment, without any worry about how others will see them. And so for them to not be able to have that, they really truly feel as though they are missing a core component of the Spelman experience. So that's one piece. The other piece that students are struggling with, and this is, I'm sure, also something that is common to campuses across the country, is being able to create spaces for their studies within their homes. So, when you go off to college, your dorm room becomes that space and you're surrounded by academics. Many of them are at home with, siblings and families, large families, many of them, where it is difficult for them to find space and quiet space at that to study and focus on their academics. And so that's the second thing. And then the third thing is that, Spelman decided to do an abbreviated semester in the fall. They decided that prior to making the decision to be completely virtual. And like many campuses, they decided that because they wanted to finish the semester before the Thanksgiving break, so that, if we had been in person, when students went home, they would not have to come back to campus, right, to try to lessen the spread of COVID. One of the things that came out in a survey that Spelman conducted with their students was that it was extremely challenging for students to have such a abbreviated semester, which also meant that there was no break in that semester. So one of the things that Spelman has implemented in the spring, we are doing an abbreviated semester again in the spring. We do not begin until February 1st, and we have removed spring break because of that. But we have added in a two-day break during when spring break would have been, because we listened to that challenge that students really do need a mental break during the semester, especially when they are experiencing an abbreviated semester. So those are some of the things that we're seeing at Spelman.
Thank you.
I might also, while we're waiting for more questions, I can also talk a little bit more about how the pandemic has impacted our ability to implement programming at Spelman, especially the research programming that I talked about. So, you know, we have our Research Scholars Program as well as our Department of Defense Faculty Fellows program, which, you know, for many of the sciences, it is extremely difficult to conduct research and especially to mentor undergraduates in research virtually. And so one of the things that we have at the center is we have what we call our internal steering committee, which is one representative from each of our natural sciences and mathematics departments. And we meet once a month, and it helps me to kind of maintain connection with those departments. And those are all faculty members, so they can really share from the faculty perspective what the center can do to support both students and faculty. And one of the adjustments that we made to our Research Scholars Program this year was that we are allowing students to get funding for completion of literature reviews and those types of things, kind of background building, which we normally wouldn't give funding for if we were face-to-face. We would require that they be doing something that has a more substantive outcome for them. But because we know that there's limits to what students can do virtually, we are allowing students to conduct literature reviews as part of their research, with the hope we are coming back in the spring with a reduced student population that we can modify that. And then on the faculty side, we are in conversations with the Department of Defense on how we can have virtual externships for our faculty during the summer at the Department of Defense. Last summer that we had to cancel everything for faculty in terms of those types of programs. But this summer we're hoping to be able to do that virtually.
Thank you. We do have a question that came in. How do we best prepare students to bridge between highly supportive environments and their next steps?
That's a really, really good question. And that's something that when I interviewed for the position at Spelman, one of the things that I talked about in my interview was that I thought that Spelman did an excellent job of supporting me and helping me to be successful as an undergrad. And then I felt almost like the rug was pulled out from under me when I transitioned into grad school, where that support was no longer there. And I'm assuming that and if that's not what you mean in terms of support, please add another question. But so one of the things that I am working on is developing partnerships with graduate programs so that we can partner on a pipeline that spreads beyond Spelman. So we've had conversations with MIT, we've had conversations with Carnegie Mellon, we've had conversations with NYU about developing partnerships that start before the student leaves Spelman, so that when they do make that transition to graduate school, they feel comfortable in the environment, they have allies in that environment, they have mentors in that environment, so that they do not feel as that it is such a stark transition as can often be for students leaving HBCUs.
Thank you. So we had another couple of questions come in. Can you share some insight, experience, or advice on introducing Black girls to STEM as early as possible?
Yeah, actually my background is K-12 education. And until I came back to Spelman, I guess it's been about 5 months ago, my entire career has been in K-12 education. And I was the Associate Director for School and Community Engagement at Georgia Tech, focused on partnerships with districts. So, you know, one of the things that I think is really important is that you, as much as possible, partner with schools on efforts to introduce students to STEM. You know, I completely understand, and I have developed and implemented many out of school programs. But we also know that the vast majority of students of color, the only introduction they get to any type of educational opportunity is in their school day. And so partnering with schools to help transform schools, I think, is the most influential way to impact large groups of students. Black girls in particular, you know, when you think about organizations like Black Girls Code and what they're doing, I think that they are a great model of how you can implement these type, if you want to do it out of school. If you're looking at in school, one of the way that we always approached it was that we thought about things from a district level. So kind of working with the school district. My focus is always on public education. So working with the school district to identify a school that has a very strong school leader that is open and receptive to outsiders coming in. Many school leaders are not. And is also open to understanding the value that higher education brings to the K-12 space. We also really think about helping students to be able to see themselves in the careers that we are trying to get them into. So, you know, bringing in role models. So, you know, the program that I always think about that I worked on until I came to Spelman was a partnership with a K-8 school in Atlanta Public Schools, where it was a partnership between Georgia Tech, the school, and NCR, which is a big tech company that has moved their world headquarters to Atlanta. And one of the things when we always talked about that partnership was that we felt as though that partnership exemplified the full pipeline, right? So you have K-12, you have higher education, and you also have industry, so that everybody is understanding their role in preparing a more diverse and equitable future for our world. And so that's the kinds of things. In terms of specifics, in terms of projects, you know, I'm a big fan of project-based learning and connecting what students are learning in STEM to what is happening in their communities and happening in the world. I feel like that, you know, it has been shown through research that girls, not even just Black girls, but girls in general, are more interested in STEM when they see the social connections to what they are learning in STEM. And so the more that you can bring in how the STEM fields are helping to make the world a better place, I think the better chance you will have of increasing interest. And I think that, you know, this last year has shown us, right, whether we're talking about the pandemic and vaccine development, whether we're talking about, you know, Zoom, right, the development of technologies to assist with online learning, right? All of these things are in the STEM fields. And so it helps to highlight for students. And also, you know, just on the other side, you know, when we talk about, you know, I talked a lot about police brutality, and, you know, the work of people like Timnit and Joy are around algorithmic bias and how the tech, you know, industry is often leveraged in support of white supremacy, right? All of these things are topics that are of extreme interest to girls and people of color. And so if you are willing to, you know, work with schools or create your own programs that tackle these topics, you will see that there will be more women and people of color that are going to be interested in those programs.
Do you have any advice for faculty in departments that are committed to supporting students from diverse backgrounds, but are located in cities with very little diversity in their community?
And I'm going to read that one. Do you have any advice for faculty in departments that are committed to supporting students from diverse backgrounds, but are located in cities with okay, very nice. Okay. I do not believe that equity and diversity have anything to do with the population that you are serving. It is a challenge and a issue that is pervasive across communities, right? So oftentimes I tell people that I would like to actually see more conversations amongst white people about equity and diversity that do not include people of color, because I feel as though those conversations will be more honest than they would be if a person of color is in the room. And so I think that, you know, allies, as Bettina Love likes to call people, co-conspirators, right, can work in areas where there are very few people of color, no people of color, because we are living in a global society, so we are all interconnected. And we also have to remember that this generation spends most of their time and connects very freely on the internet. So their community is much broader than the physical location that they are living in.
Thank you. One question that came in from the chat: has Spelman found ways to support faculty care providers who are caring for students and their own families?
I cannot answer that. I do know that that has been a struggle for our faculty. I am not on the faculty side of Spelman, so I'm not considered faculty. I'm considered staff, so I am not involved in faculty council meetings, those kinds of things. So unfortunately, I do not know what Spelman has put in place for faculty care providers. I do know that, you know, Spelman is completely virtual and has been very flexible with everybody in terms of making accommodations so that we can all kind of get through this together.
Thank you. The pandemic has financially affected a couple of Black students. The stress of working at home and not having funding to pay for college meant that one couldn't take classes and the other had to lessen her course load. Where can we seek funding for Black students to pursue higher ed?
I'm not sure if you're talking about as an institution or if you're talking about for individual scholarships.
Good question. There's not a lot of
if you can clarify
background for that.
That would be helpful.
Okay. Going on to the next question. What role do you see collaborations between identity-based and diversity-focused student groups playing in supporting and encouraging minorities on campus?
Can you say that one more time? I have a hard time following when people read. I'm trying to find them.
No, that's okay. What role do you see collaborations between identity-based and diversity-focused student groups playing in supporting and encouraging minorities on campus?
You know, I think it's tricky. I know when I was at Tech and we would work with student groups, can be a tricky process in terms of helping. Like, students really want to be helpful and they want to be engaged, and that college students often think they already know everything. That's the best way that I can say it, right? So it can often be that, you know, I find that when you're working with student groups, it's nice to have somebody who's an actual expert in that topic leading those conversations and leading that work. And the student groups are there as support. That's what I have found to be the best. These are really sensitive topics that you're talking about. And although people have the best of intentions, we all bring our biases into the room. And so it can be really helpful in terms of creating a safe space for everybody. If you have somebody involved that this is what they do as their work. And that could be somebody on your campus, that could be bringing in somebody external. And sometimes it's good to bring in an external kind of contractor that has no affiliation with your institution at all, because they can really help to dig deep into these topics. But yeah, and then the second thing that I'll say about that is, I always think about, and I don't know if this is a real acronym, but I saw it in a movie, the acronym ALOHA, which is ask the person what they need help with, listen, offer to help, and then ask again, right? And I think if we all did that, there would be fewer kind of clashes around, you know, you're over speaking me, or you think you know what I need, and you're right. Like if we let the people that we say we want to help be the first to speak and say what they actually need, and believe them when they say what they need, and then move from there, I think that we'll make more progress. And that's a skill that college students often have to be taught.
Have you seen any students shifting or changing their major based on the COVID-19 pandemic?
I haven't looked at data specifically on changing major, and I don't know if you're talking specifically about Spelman. We did recently just ask for data about major changing in general at Spelman around STEM, and we were actually really surprised at how few Spelman students change their major out of STEM, but I have not looked at data specifically on students changing their major as a result of the pandemic. And actually, I should have also said, one of the things that we were really surprised about was that enrollment at Spelman College is actually up during the pandemic. We were very concerned that because of the high cost of Spelman and the fact that Spelman decided to be completely virtual in the fall, that enrollment would be down, but enrollment is actually up.
Thank you. So going back to the funding, I think there was some clarification. Where can students seek funding outside of their institutions to assist with college?
Oh, I am not a scholarship expert. I find like the financial aid office would probably be the best place to look at for scholarships.
And I think that was our final question.
Okay, I did get a direct message question that says, do you have any data on whether remote learning / COVID has affected students' academic progress in STEM? I know we at Spelman are doing our own internal survey, and those results have not been released yet. So they did a large survey with Spelman students around not just academic progress, but mental health, everything. And so we should have that data soon. And I do know, as I said, my background is K-12 education, that there's lots of reports that have come out around the loss of learning as a result of remote learning and COVID, and how it disproportionately impacts students of color and low-income students.
Thank you very much. And was that our final question? Do you have any other questions direct?
No, I don't think so. If I do, I missed them.
Okay.
Thank you, Sheila, for facilitating that.
Thank you, Dr. Pearson. I've enjoyed your talk, and I hope everyone else has enjoyed your talk as well. So our next, we have a coffee break scheduled from 11 o'clock to 11:15. And our next session, the research panel, will start at 11:15. Participants can stay in the webinar during the coffee break, and we will see you back here. All right, thank you.
Thank you for that introduction and for inviting us to be here today. We are excited to give you a sneak peek of the data from our Nsf Rapid Grant that was awarded to us in May. And our aim with this grant was to examine the differential impacts of the pandemic and the emergency move to remote instruction on STEM undergraduates by gender and race. So as we know, and we heard a little bit about this earlier, large national survey data of undergraduate students during the pandemic have revealed that indeed the pandemic has had an impact on undergraduate education. Some particularly concerning findings are that more than 4 in 10 students report having lots of job or internship opportunity as a result of the pandemic. There was a study that showed 4 in 10 freshmen over the summer had said that they were likely to consider skipping the fall semester entirely, which raises enormous retention risks we'll need to be looking into this year. And only 17% of undergraduates surveyed about last spring were satisfied with how much they were learning. It's also notable that millions and millions of Americans don't have access to broadband at home, and millions more have inadequate access. So we believe that courses in STEM fields may be particularly difficult to move online with little preparation time, given the use of labs, things like chalk talks, all of which require the use of specialized technologies to conduct remotely in any sort of effective way. So if the quality of STEM education was negatively impacted by the pivot to emergency remote instruction, we certainly need studies to assess the differential impacts on women, especially BIPOC women who are underrepresented. And this could be the cause of yet more leaks to that STEM pipeline. So that was the goal of our study. So in terms of framework, we based our research on the socio-ecological model, which depicts the multi-level factors that influence academic performance and psychosocial functioning. So many of us are very mindful of factors at that individual level. They're in the blue circle at the bottom. These are things that we kind of know affect our students. However, interpersonal, organizational, community, and public policy level factors also influence our student success. So let me give you an example. Differential impacts at the policy level in the past year could be variability in state level policies regarding COVID. States with looser policies, we saw a higher spread of COVID in those communities over the summer and spring, and even to present time. An example of a community level factor that may have differentially impacted students by race are the events of the summer, the police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, and the Black Lives Matter marches that ensued across the nation in protest of police brutality against the Black community. So we sought to explore how all of these events of 2020 impacted STEM undergraduate students. We collected 3 types of data. The first was qualitative in the form of focus groups that were evenly distributed by race, gender, and SES to learn about those barriers the students experienced during the spring. That same sample completed a survey regarding their concerns going into the fall semester. And then finally, at the end of the fall, just a few short weeks ago, we collected survey data from 1,000 STEM students across the country with equal representation across race, gender, and SES. So here you see the demographic characteristics of the 59 students who attended our focus groups by Zoom over the summer. And you can see kind of how they were balanced, recruited from all over the country in Puerto Rico. Focus group participants were queried about their experiences in the classroom, at home, in their communities, and with their universities. Their responses then were used to develop survey questions so that we could quantitatively measure these barriers on a large scale and have the power to actually look at differential impacts. So let me tell you a little bit about barriers in the classroom that we saw. I'll just give you kind of a sneak peek of this data, but you'll see a link at the bottom of this slide where you can see the paper, the preprint that we have out if you're interested in learning a little bit more. So the most common cited barriers students cited included instructors increasing the workload or difficulty level of their STEM courses. And this was at times intentional, well, because instructors thought it might prevent cheating, and then other times unintentional. So for example, students said lots of new assignments were added, like posting regularly on discussion boards, or exams were converted into very complex projects that actually created more work for them at a time when they were already feeling very stressed. Instructors, never having taught online, weren't necessarily prepared to design their courses in a way to prevent cheating. And so these sort of brute force policies like just changing the curve or making exams harder were used, as students shared with us. So this points to the possibility that instructors weren't using remote teaching technologies in ways that necessarily optimized their instruction. STEM students also cited feeling disengaged from their instructors and their classmates, which raised our concern about impacts on things like sense of belonging and intentions to stay in a STEM major among the individuals who are underrepresented in STEM. So we explored this in our survey that Dr. Brown will be discussing momentarily. Students also pointed to teaching modalities that were ineffective to them, such as when instructors just posted content, but provided few, if any, opportunities to interface or communicate with the instructor or class. Related, while students appreciated having lectures recorded, that gave them a lot of flexibility, so that was a strength. But when it was solely relied upon, they felt that watching videos all day was very taxing on attention and concentration. Sometimes the videos were recycled and seemed outdated. But overall, it seemed apparent from students' responses that best practices for remote learning were largely not being employed. So I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Waring, who will speak about our data related to students' biggest concerns going into the fall 2020 semester.
Great. So as part of this phase of the project, we asked students as they were participating in focus groups to fill out a short online survey. And in that survey, we asked them 2 open-ended questions about their concerns for the coming fall semester. So we asked them about their concerns about returning to campus, and then separately their concerns about staying at home and learning online. So I'd like you all to note that with about 60 students, we know we are not powered to look at gender differences. In the next couple of slides, I do present the percentage of women versus men who endorsed each concern. As part of our thinking in terms of where do we look like there might be gender differences and something that we might want to pay more attention to in the larger survey. So again, sort of keep in mind the study sample. Next slide, please, Sherry. Great. So in terms of their concerns about coming back to campus in fall 2020, the most common concern was about student non-compliance to campus COVID-19 prevention guidelines. So this is a concern that other students wouldn't be following social distancing or mask wearing. Also, there were concerns about the way campus life is structured with dorm living or meals or shared bathrooms, that it would be hard for students to really comply with sort of behavioral prevention guidelines. One thing that I think is interesting here is that 40% of women versus 15% of men shared this concern. Another common concern was the concern of getting sick and also of subsequently infecting family members. So here students talked about, obviously the concern of getting sick themselves, but then also commuting students bringing the virus home to their family as they commute back and forth to campus. Also students saying, I'm concerned that I will go to campus, that will get shut down halfway through the semester, and that I will come home and infect a family member who may not survive the virus. Older family members, immunocompromised family members. So this was a common concern shared by students. Next slide. Additional concerns about coming back to campus for the fall semester related to the educational quality. So they were concerned about poor quality of online courses, which you may ask, well, if they're returning to campus, why are they studying online? Many schools had a bunch of classes online, even for students who were on campus. And so students were concerned about the quality of these online courses, especially given their experience in the spring where, we all put courses online very suddenly. So they were concerned about similar things happening in the fall. Students are also concerned about a lack of hands-on learning, such as science labs or engineering labs or hands-on research experiences, and also about inadequate access to campus resources, including the library, tutoring centers, or fitness centers, or other more residential facilities. A bunch of students were also concerned about that their university had inadequate plans to prevent an outbreak, and also repercussions of sudden campus closing. A couple of students, said, I don't mean to be cynical, but I think my university is just having us come to campus so they can cash our checks for room and board, and then they'll send us home. This is another place where we see a suggestion that perhaps women were more concerned about this than men, with 30% versus 19%, expressing this concern about that the university doesn't have good plans to protect them. Finally, it's not on the slide, but about 10% of students expressed concern about reduced opportunities to socialize given prevention guidelines and social distancing. And another 10% were concerned about transportation, such as parking on campus or feeling safe or being safe on public transportation to come to campus. So you can see in terms of concerns about coming back to campus for the fall, there's a mix of health concerns and educational concerns, and social concerns. Next slide, please. So in terms of their concerns about staying home and learning online in fall 2020, by far the most common concern expressed by students was the difficulty staying focused on schoolwork or staying motivated in online courses. So many students flat out said, online learning just doesn't work for me. Or they said, it's hard for me to stay focused and motivated when I'm just sitting through, impersonal pre-recorded lectures for 4 hours straight. This really concept of that they were finding it difficult to stay engaged with their coursework when they were learning online entirely. Again, here we see a common concern is a lack of hands-on or experiential learning, such as, again, labs, engineering labs, research opportunities, and also a real concern that a lack of in-person interactions with faculty and with other students would hinder their learning. Next slide. We also see that about a fifth of students were concerned about staying at home and learning online would have a negative impact on their social life, including missing friends or feeling lonely and challenges staying connected with friends. This is something that we know in the, from developmental literature, during emerging adulthood, connections with peers and with friends is really important. And so this is something, that many students were concerned about with not returning to campus. It's also interesting that another concern that was raised by many students was a concern that their family or their home environment would prevent a barrier to learning. So this included people who said, well, now that I'm home, my parents are going to expect me to help with chores more or help babysit younger siblings. Some students said, you know, at home, I don't have a private, quiet place to study. And so I'm concerned about being able to engage fully in schoolwork when I'm sitting at the dining room table and, you know, people are walking in and out of the room all the time. Some people also just said, you know, it's hard to stay motivated, you know, when I don't have sort of a quote work environment, you know, so they may have had a private room or private bedroom, but there are distracting things in there and they wouldn't have been doing their schoolwork in that sort of an environment if they were on campus. So thinking about these, you know, sort of environmental or home structural barriers getting in way of learning. We also saw that a handful of students expressed concern about technology or adequacy of Wi-Fi to engage fully in courses, especially when professors required turning on video, something that they had experienced in the spring and were concerned about in the fall. I am not surprised that we only saw a handful of responses from this group for the focus group participants, because this is a group of students who volunteered to do a 90-minute focus group via Zoom. So clearly we're going to overrepresent students who do not have problems with Wi-Fi. And so given the national data we're seeing about the availability of Wi-Fi and the disparities in that and undergraduate learners and also K-12 learners, that is definitely something that we asked about in our larger survey. So as you can see, concerns about staying home and learning online, they encompass educational concerns, social concerns, structural concerns about home, you know, technological concerns. There's a range of things that students were concerned about, you know, how they would handle the fall and how they would be successful in their academics in the fall if they were staying at home and learning online. So these results from our qualitative data that Sherry and I have just presented illustrate some barriers and problems experienced by a bunch of students. And again, this was really, you know, the focus groups are really intended to help us ask the right questions. You know, we went into this saying, you know, we want to make sure we're asking the right questions in the survey. So the focus group gave us the kind of questions that we would want to ask in this larger survey. And so Nate is going to talk about next some of our hot off the press preliminary results from our larger survey.
Thank you. Yeah, so I don't need to set up this next phase that has just been done wonderfully by Dr. Waring, but let me just say where we're at with this. This is really a status report, if you will. We started collecting data through our big survey nationwide almost exactly a month ago, and we're in the final stages of data collection. We're over 95% complete with our data collection. So I can only present for you a small sample of preliminary results, but here they are. As you can see on the slide there, we do have a pretty broad swath of STEM students, 40 states, 100+ colleges and universities, pretty well equally distributed by gender, race, ethnicity, and SES. The first result that I want to talk about is related to the variable called sense of belonging, which, as this name suggests, refers to a student's sense that they belong in some domain. Do they feel like an outsider? Is this a comfortable space for them? Now, this variable, sense of belonging, was highlighted by the National Academy of Sciences in 2017. And it's important because, on the one hand, sense of belonging is associated with student outcomes. The more a student feels they belong, the more likely they are to succeed. But on the other hand, sense of belonging is malleable. It can change from context to context. So external events can influence a student's sense of belonging. So as such, we decided to ask, how has learning, online learning, impacted students' sense of belonging? And as you can see, a very large percentage of our students, male and female, report that online learning has negatively impacted their sense of belonging. But this is a problem for all students, but not equally so. There are differential impacts, with women being more likely than men to report that learning online has negatively impacted their sense of belonging. Our next question is about the impact of online learning on intent to stay in a STEM major. That is, potential impacts of online learning on STEM major retention. And if we look at those results, we again see that this is a problem for all students. About 1/3 of our students reported a decrease in their intent to stay as a result of online learning. However, this time the differential impact between the genders is at the other end of the spectrum, with 42% of men reporting an increase in their intent to stay. Now, this was a surprise. We didn't expect this, and we don't have an interpretation of this result, but it does suggest an important follow-up project. Perhaps what we could do is we could talk to these men, find out what contributed to their increased intent to stay, and perhaps use that information to tailor interventions rather, that would increase more women's intent to stay in STEM majors. Thoughts from the audience would be greatly appreciated, or we'll just make this a follow-up study, I guess. Anyway, so the next step, we saw gender differences in sense of belonging and intent to stay, so we decided to drill down a little further and look at differential impacts by race. When we looked at how Asian women responded and Black women, Hispanic, white women, we again see that learning online had a negative impact on sense of belonging. But when you look more carefully, what you see is that those impacts aren't uniform. Black and Hispanic women are significantly more likely to report a negative impact. And similarly, when we look at the next slide, we will see that learning online did not equally impact everyone in terms of their intent to stay. This time, it seems that Black women are much more likely to report rather a decrease in their intent to stay as a result of the online learning. So that's just a couple of results. I'd like to emphasize again that our survey is a very rich source of data. We have not been able to analyze most of the questions that we ask. And that was because we were trying to get at this whole socio-ecological model, all the various layers in which learning takes place. But there was a major event in 2020. We certainly did not predict it when we put in our grant back in April. It's already been mentioned by Dr. Pagano, and that is the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. So we asked about that in our survey. And when we look at the impact, the self-reported impact that these things had on sense of belonging, again, it's negative and concerning across the board, but the impacts were not uniformly distributed. Black and Hispanic women were significantly greater than Asian and white women to report negative impacts as a result of the police brutality that we all witnessed. This was our hypothesis, of course, but it's absolutely heartbreaking to see it confirmed. However, there may be a silver lining here. If you look at the bottom row, what you'll see is that across the board, large percentages of women reported an increased sense of belonging. Now, this was a surprise to us as well, but it may reflect the power of the Black Lives Matter protest to bring us together, united against police brutality. Given that the Confederate flag, a symbol of white supremacy and hate, was just flown for the very first time in our nation's Capitol building during last week's insurrection. I hope we'll all think about ways to come together in united opposition to the systemic racism and sexism that's embedded in our institutions. So I'd like to close real quick with some recommendations suggested by our work. I'll try to wrap this up as quick as I can here. The first is one that I know I personally need to do a much better job of. I don't think there's any surprises here. We all need to be implementing best practices in remote teaching. The next recommendation is clearly suggested by our work. We need to identify these students who have had a decreased sense of belonging, intent to stay, wavering in some way, and find a way to meet their needs. Our final recommendation, though, is to train instructors on socio-ecological factors. And to set the stage for this recommendation, let me quickly describe how I thought about teaching for the first 20 years or so of my career. I thought that good teaching was mostly about articulate explanations of hard concepts, choosing examples very carefully, giving challenging but fair exams. I only saw teaching from my perspective. Was I conveying the math well? As opposed to asking, how well my students were receiving the math. Now, anecdotally, this perspective is very widespread amongst university math instructors, and it's a real problem. When instructors only focus on the math or the chemistry or whatever discipline they teach, the other layers of a socio-ecological model aren't visible. And tons of research shows these other layers are very important for student success. So our recommendation here is to train instructors in this broader way of thinking about learning and student success. For instance, if you have a TA training program for grad students at your institution, does it include modules which raise awareness about other layers in the socio-ecological model? Does it include training in empathy, emotional intelligence, interpersonal skills? So our instructors are better equipped to meet the needs of students whose socio-ecological reality, not the model, but their reality, impedes their ability to succeed. Now, of course, similar questions apply to training of all instructors. We're just choosing TA training because it might be sort of lower hanging fruit, if you will. But certainly all instructors, I think, could use some professional development in this area. Anyway, that's our final recommendation. So on behalf of our team, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, sorry. That's a closing tweet.
That we really felt kind of resonated with this idea that 2020 was just sort of a funky year as opposed to an example of bigger issues.
Thank you very, very much. That was a very enlightening, distressing set of findings and I think your recommendations really move us toward solutions. We're going to come back to the Q&A, but again, thank you. I'd like to, we're going to go to Dr. Haley Brown and then come back for Q&A for everybody when she's finished. So are you ready to go?
Sure, yeah. And so I'm just Haley Brown, not Dr. Haley Brown.
I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you for the promotion though. Let me share my screen here. All right, is everyone seeing not my secret notes on the side, the real thing?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, I'm Haley Brown. I'm the Director of Evaluation Research at AnitaB.org, previously known as the Anita Borg Institute for Women in Technology. Just a quick little bit about AnitaB.org. So we're a nonprofit based out of the Bay Area in California. Our mission statement is that we envision a future where the people who imagine and build technology mirror the people in societies for who they build it. We are best known for running the Grace Hopper Celebration, which is the largest conference of women technologists in the world. We do that once a year in October, but we also have a full suite of services in which we are trying to increase the representation of women and women of color technologists. And we have several intervention points. So we work directly with women technologists. We also have a whole public policy wing in our organization that works on Capitol Hill to advocate for public policy initiatives that affect technologists and especially women technologists. We work with founders to increase the representation of women and women of color founders in the tech ecosystem. And then we also work directly with companies because like we were just hearing from Dr. Brown, this is not, you can't just focus on an individual. You really need to focus on the environment that we're in. So we work with companies on how they can change their structural and organizational policies to create more equity and inclusion in the workplace. So that's a little bit about us. This research that we did was sort of came up because what we know from past research with disasters and pandemics is that they have historically had a disproportionately negative impact on women. And we were immediately seeing those outcomes for women and women of color in relation to this, with the majority of job losses being for women of color, the majority of women on the front lines for healthcare. Oh, my cat has made an appearance. But given that our population is women technologists, we were interested in how is this uniquely impacting women technologists so that we could understand and best serve our population. So quick note on how we define technologists. AnitaB.org used to be specifically, when it was started, about the computing community, because the computing within STEM, many of you probably know, computing has been on the decline for about 30 years when it comes to representation of women. But we, about 10 years ago or so, we expanded that to really include anyone who works in computing and information technology. So that's our population. And we just wanted to understand how we can serve that, because what we know is that women's representation within the field of technology, the tech workforce, is already so low and so slow growing that this pandemic stands to jeopardize that already low and slow growing representation. So with that in mind, we conducted a very quick, very rapid survey. Data collection was from March 27th through April 6th. We had an N of about 2,600 responses. 80% of those were women. 78% were technologists. So we have a question where we got whether or not they identified as a technologist or not. 47% were people of color. 28% were in the LGBTQ community, and 15% of respondents were students. So we were really looking at, because of where we stand as an organization, we work on the entire tech ecosystem. But so the students was just a piece of that, and this research that we did was just a piece of it with students. But we're looking at all different personas. But today I called out just specific findings from the student responses. So the student responses had an N of 233. Now 90% of those were women. So when looking at analyses that we could run, we couldn't really run any gender differences since we had one male respondent who was a student. 56% of the student responses were people of color, 37% were international students, 33% were Black, Latinx, Native American, or Pacific Islander. 33% are caregivers, 30% are in the LGBTQ community, and 20% were living with a disability. So as I said, this was the full span of the research. The research we did was very broad, very quick. We were really just, I mean, honestly, we were going fishing and trying to find out what's going on with our population, how can we help, what are their needs. So for student findings, some quick information that we found when it comes to the impact on students. So the impact on the actual for their schooling, 84% have reported shifting to online learning, and 34% shifted to a pass-fail system. 33% reported that they may delay their ability to the pandemic might delay their ability to graduate on time. And 26% report that their work study or funding or job had been canceled. 14% reported having to drop some or all classes, and also 14% reported that the pandemic may, that they might not be able to return to school next year. So we were particularly concerned with that 33% may delay my ability to graduate on time. We also, given that we work with industry and with companies, we're also very, and what we specifically work with a lot at AnitaB.org is connecting companies with students for internships and entry-level jobs. So we were also really looking at how is this impacting internships and first jobs for students. So 40% of students reported that they had a job or internship interview canceled. 31% have had a job offer postponed or rescinded. 28% have been laid off from their internship or job, and 25% have had their internship postponed or rescinded. So some strong impact there when it comes to the job prospects. One of the things that we also asked about were internal experiences. And so we asked how the pandemic impacted certain internal experiences that could potentially impact their lives, how they show up at school, how they show up at work. And so not surprisingly, the number one increase that we saw from students was an increase in loneliness. We saw that across all populations. Also large increases in numbness, fear, or disbelief. Remember, this was in March, so this was right when it happened. Stress about personal finances, concerns about losing job, anger, irritability, and self-criticism. Self-care actually also increased, which that was really interesting. But yeah, that fear, loneliness was huge. Another really interesting thing that we saw when looking just at the student population was we had the most interactions. So we ran several different tests against demographic characteristics. Like I said, for students, we couldn't run gender, but we ran whether there were differential impacts for Black students, for Latinx students, for students with disability, LGBTQ. But the most interactions we saw by far were from international students and from students who were also caregivers. So like I said, 33% of our students reported being primary caregivers, and that includes elder care. 10% of our students were primary caregivers to children, which is actually lower than the national average, which is 22% of students in America are parents. So we cannot discount the fact that students are also caregivers, and caregivers are really struggling and have extra burdens during this pandemic. So students are having to deal with both the increased labor, increased childcare, child education, while dealing with just trying to survive in this pandemic. International students also face additional challenges that we saw, especially in relation to not having some basic services. And in the qualitative analysis, we saw that this was due to lacking a community domestically. So many students have family, friends, a community that when everything went haywire, they could rely on, where international students have all of that back home. And so the international students that were here during the pandemic, we saw that they were 6.2 times more likely to report that they were experiencing homelessness than domestic students. And that was a big increase also from their pre-pandemic. So risk of homelessness really increased and was significantly more when it came to international students versus domestic students. We see here all of the significant interactions that we saw, and all of these had worse outcomes for international students and caregivers. And then in the middle, you see that was both of them had those interactions. When it comes to international students, a lot of the STEM community is made up of international students, especially the graduate STEM community. One figure I found said that 79% of graduate students in Comp Sci are international. We also saw a lot of significant interactions for students with disabilities and LGBTQ students. So those should also be minded, but these were the two biggest groups. So just some quick recommendations based on the research that we saw. So when we asked students about things that could help, when we asked anyone, flexibility is obviously the number one thing. It's very obvious, but it cannot be discounted how important this was. So students that were given the pass-fail situation or had flexible deadlines were really said that those gave them positive impacts. And also, we recommend facilitating virtual career fairs and notifying students of external virtual career fair opportunities. As we saw, there are some real impacts to their ability to get internships and jobs. We really strongly recommend connecting students to mental health resources provided by both the school and the broader community. And especially if in relation to LGBTQ students, students with disabilities, where we saw significant worse outcomes for them. Definitely broadband issues that we saw. And so just ensuring that students have reliable access to internet and stable housing. So within organizations doing these surveys of your students to see what basic necessities toward learning that they need. And in those surveys, we really recommend making sure to include a question that accounts for whether or not they are international and whether or not they're a caregiver, since these are specific demographics that are struggling during this pandemic. And finally, so we do have, we have also received a Nsf Rapid Grant that we are doing in collaboration with the National Center for Women in Technology and the STARS Computing Alliance. So the three organizations are working on a rapid grant for COVID-19 as well. And just when we've done analysis for the first survey, and one of the findings of that was that empathy and emotional support from professors was a huge game changer. So students saying that having their instructors show concern for them had a positive impact on their learning outcomes during the pandemic. Similarly, hosting virtual student support meetings like check-ins or mental health workshops also had statistically significant better outcomes for students' ability to learn. So really leading with that empathy. I love also this idea that we heard before of teaching how the socio-ecological model is impacting that. That brings empathy into it as well, understanding not just the student as an individual, but the student in the environment that they're in. So that's a real game changer for students. So those are our recommendations. Like I said, yeah. Hello? Is there a question?
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm the moderator. Did you want to say something else?
Yeah, just real quick. So as I mentioned, we do have a one-year National Science Foundation grant. So we're doing 3 surveys over the course of 1 year. Our first report is to be published next week. And like the group we heard from before, as we were developing our first survey for this, that was in the summer. George Floyd was murdered. And so we did sort of a tweak to our approach where we're looking at both the compounding impacts of racism and COVID-19 on learning and computing and technology. So as I said, our first report will be published next week and we'll have 2 more forthcoming reports after that.
Tremendous. Thank you. That was also very, very informative. Let me just ask both groups right off. There's been a lot of interest in either your deck, getting your slide deck. I see a little bit about, we have the preprint from the first group, and then Haley, your first report is coming out. If you could send that to us, we could distribute it to this group, or just send us the link. But there's a lot.
I just popped a link into, we had a report based on the pilot research that I mostly presented on today. So I put that report in there. Now that includes all personas, not just students, but that's the report that we have. And then we'll be having another report next week and I can send that to you when that's published.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, now it's time for Q&A. I want to just start for a couple minutes and ask the panelists just to reflect on where you might see points of convergence between the findings that you've presented, or points of where you see opportunities for thinking about other questions. But do you see that now? Yeah.
I will say, Dr. Brown, Dr. Haley Brown, there's 2 Dr. Browns, findings were definitely resonated with not only what we presented, but also some stuff we didn't have time to present in terms of flexibility and empathy. That slide where you had all those things listed, those were also things that came up when we had asked our students what were facilitators or what helped you, what were things that universities and instructors did that helped you be successful. And so when I was seeing her present that slide, I thought, oh, that's exactly what we heard. So it was great to see that you're hearing some of the same things.
Tremendous. Does anybody want to add anything to that?
I guess I'd like to just second that, focusing on the last part, the empathy part. You know, this is something that somehow we all feel, but I think it's really helpful that two completely separate research groups are landing at the same place on this. There really can be no doubt of its importance.
Wonderful, and that's certainly a message we can disseminate at our universities.
And I think it also has implications for going forward. So one could hope that that the COVID-19 epidemic does not last forever, and that the U.S. and the world gets it under control. But thinking ahead towards the next several years and going on to the future, thinking about what's going on in the world right now and what might my students be having a rough time with, even if maybe as the faculty member it doesn't impact them as personally, but maybe encouraging faculty to have spaces either as part of their class time or office hours or other times to say, hey, I noticed this thing going on in the world that may be impacting some of you or that is impacting me. How are you doing about it? Are you okay? Or thinking, wow, there's this thing that might be very stressful. Let me not schedule a midterm on a day when something is going to be really stressful in the external world. And so, thinking about, empathy for students and thinking about how do we, take this larger view as what is not just going on in students' families or communities, but in their communities and in the country, and think about how do we provide empathy and flexibility around these external events that may be impacting their engagement with our classes and their academic success.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what we're also saying, so we asked questions in the survey one that we did under our NSF grant, where we asked how the pandemic impacted certain indicators, but then also how the recent attention to racial justice and racism impacted it. And we were seeing the exact same finding about empathy impacting learning outcomes for students when the professor around racism and anti-racism as well. So it's not just something that applies to the pandemic. It just it's effective across the board.
Exactly. I do hope that both of your projects produce papers on this. And I think it's true not only for faculty, but for those of us here in the room, so to speak, who offer co-curricular programs, that broad sense of understanding where students sit and live is vitally important for outcomes. So I'd like to thank you for that. I'd like to turn to some questions that have come in. So one, and this doesn't seem to be directed to any either team, either group, but one question is, do you think your findings about learning for women in STEM during COVID times are a quantitative or qualitative difference from the quote, regular environment?
I guess I'm not quite sure what that means.
If it's asking have there been changes, I think maybe it's asking if we saw any differences pre and post pandemic, perhaps. And I mean, we certainly did. So we specifically asked how things had changed since the pandemic. And one thing that I didn't present on, we also looked really closely at domestic labor, and we asked about hours spent on domestic labor pre and post pandemic, and there was a real increase in domestic labor hours spent, and we saw significant interactions there with on whether or not they were Black or Latinx women, and then also on their sexual orientation. So straight women had a larger increase in domestic hours, labor, rather than members of the LGBTQ community. So, I mean, I would say probably everybody's research shows that everything is a lot worse post-pandemic. So.
The follow-up to the question is the pandemic's effects are generalizable to other challenges?
Yeah, that's it. Well, I think one thing about the pandemic, and I have a background that's mostly kind of in public health, and we're seeing that in public health too, is like anything that was weak became weaker because of the stress of the pandemic. I think it's sort of a unique challenge in a lot of ways, but I think we shouldn't consider this sort of a one-time unusual thing that happened that's probably not going to happen again, and take this as an opportunity to be prepared next time. I hope one of the things I was a little bit paranoid about when I was presenting was I hope that instructors aren't going to feel like the message is you didn't do well, because instructors are feeling an enormous amount of stress as well, and myself included. But I think what we need to do is take this as an opportunity to learn best practices for remote instruction, so it's not so novel in the future, because things like this could happen again. There are lots of science out there showing with climate change that this probably not going to be the last pandemic. There are other natural disasters we're seeing that they're happening at a higher frequency than the past. So I think this should be our sort of wake-up call to be prepared and learn how to do better, because each one of these incidents is obviously going to be a step backwards. And this one, we don't even know when it's going to end and how long this is going to last. So I think that was one of the big things that I personally learned from diving into this research-wise.
Do you think that the lessons learned so far apply to the co-curricular programming that happen outside of the classroom? And that's what many of us at this conference are working on. Living learning communities, research opportunities, speaker series. I don't know if you heard the first speaker, but she was, leadership development, career development. I know it may be a stretch, but can you imagine how your findings could be applied to those kinds of programs?
Well, so in addition to teaching in the classroom, primarily graduate level, I also have students involved in my research, both undergraduate and graduate students in my research. And fortunately, my program of research was already doing a lot of things, online or engaging with people remotely. And so we were able to transition, which meant that I've been able to keep students fully engaged in my program of research, with no shutdown, which has been great, especially in an era where lots of students had summer internships canceled or other research opportunities vanish or disappear. And a couple of things that, that I have, sort of happy surprises or sort of, happy things that I've learned is one, I can offer internships or involvement in my research for students at our regional campuses. Since we've been doing our team meetings via WebEx, I don't see any reason why I should suddenly next year require that students be on my campus versus if there's a promising student at another campus who's really interested in my research. We have demonstrated that we can effectively hold team meetings via phone or via WebEx. Similarly, I'm, on social media, I'm in groups of other academic research moms. I have young children. I hang out with other women in academia and in STEM who have young children. And there's a lot of interest in, being able to take some of what we've been able to do in terms of virtual conferences and allow that to be more accessible. So more accessible to having more speakers. You don't have to have, in order for me to participate in a conference in California, that's 3 days of flight, a day to get out there, a day to be there, and a day to get back. And especially thinking about wanting to support or more early career folks, in terms of postdocs or junior faculty, not having to take away a lot of time when they're caregivers, or, as Haley was talking about, students, undergraduate students who are maybe caregivers, being able to have students be able to participate in conferences that are offered virtually opens up opportunities that might not be, feasible or affordable for in-person. Similarly, as a faculty member, I like to support my students to attend conferences. But if you think about flying the students somewhere and then putting them in a hotel and conference, I only have a limited amount of funds to do that. Whereas, this year already, I've been able to support more students to attend virtual events because they're more affordable in terms of the total cost of attendance. So I think we should really be thinking about going forward, what kind of opportunities can we offer, that don't require physical co-presence? And what are the positive things that we have experienced that, or the positive things that we've had to develop, and what can we move forward to make opportunities more equitable, to make opportunities available to more people who may not feel like, may not be able to or afford to or feel comfortable, going to another city for a semester-long internship or even for a couple-day conferences. As I've just noted in the chat, their comment is hosting things virtually also makes them more accessible to those with disabilities and chronic illnesses. Absolutely. So I think there's a lot that we can take from the things that we have had to do and say, what are the things that we've had to do that will make, our academic offerings, our professional development opportunities more accessible to everybody.
Thank you. So, we have 3 minutes left, though I have a feeling we could go on for a long time. We have another question. Are there resources for best practices in remote learning and addressing socio-ecological factors? I would say in the classroom or beyond the classroom in these co-curricular programs that we do.
So yes to the first. There's a lot of research about best practices in online learning. I speak for myself, but I don't think I'm alone here. We learned of its existence through this project. We are not experts in this work, but it is certainly out there, and there are some references in the preprint that we have posted. With regard to teaching practices, inclusive teaching practices, I'm not aware of existing trainings, best practices, but what I am aware of is a ton of research around what people like me, mathematicians who teach, things that we don't think of as being important in class, like empathy. There's a lot of research that shows, student outcomes are affected by this, that showing being a caring professor, being interested in your students, these sorts of things, just raising general emotional intelligence, these have an impact, and there's tons of research to show it. So what I really am imagining is in an existing grad TA training program, for example, or some sort of professional development, just simply having someone present some of this research that these things matter, that how you interact with your students and how they feel, their confidence in their ability to succeed, how that impacts their actual performance, a sort of review of the existing research about these other aspects would be a tremendous step in the first step in the right direction. And as far as I know, that's the most that's out there right now. Another wonderful research project would be to develop a proper curriculum for something like that.
Yes, thank you. That's terrific. Well, I want to wrap up if by asking again if there are any reports or the slide deck that we can share with our audience. If you could send those to us, I think there's a lot of, again, there's a lot of interest in there, in that, as what you have now and what comes later. If you send them over to Rutgers, that would be tremendous. And I want to thank you for doing this research and participating and presenting this. This was a very, very important, powerful set of findings. I think will have an impact on how we work. So thank you. We are now, in terms of the conference, we're taking a lunch break. So for about a half hour, right? So we come back here to listen. So we come back here at 1:45 when we're going to actually hear from students directly about how they've experienced this period. So we'll see you at 12:45. And thank you all for participating. And again, thank you to the presentations, to the presenters. Okay, have a nice break, everybody. Bye-bye.
Panel, our program highlights for women in STEM during COVID-19, and Maria Gallo is facilitating that next section. So I'm going to sign off.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful to hear from the students with all these practical and helpful ideas. I'm going to let my fellow panelists join me here, and so that we can turn and pivot and now think about some of the programs that have been designed to offer insights. Some of the programs that have led, that have been implemented during this time, during this challenging time, for supporting undergraduate women in STEM. And so before we jump in, I'd like to start off by letting my panelists introduce themselves. Samantha Franco, if you want to go first.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And first, I do want to say thank you to the students who were in the previous panel. It's great to hear directly from students. And so I just really appreciate them taking time out of their Friday to share those. And I've been taking notes on some really great programming that we can do this spring. But so happy to be here. My name is Sam Franco. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Assistant Director of WISE, which is our Women in Science and Engineering program at the University of Minnesota.
Thanks, Sam. Nicole, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nicole Wadzinski. I'm the director of our undergraduate research programs in STEM, which we lovingly call Project Super. And I'm also the director of our Douglas Engineering Living Learning Community, which is for women in the School of Engineering, as well as Douglas women on campus here. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Jan?
Hello, I'm Jan Plain. I am a faculty member in the Computer Science Department and the director of both our ERIB Initiative for Inclusion and Diversity in Computing and the Maryland Center for Women in Computing.
Thanks. And lastly, Victoria.
Hello, I'm Victoria Alden from the University of Michigan. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the project manager for the Women in Science and Engineering unit at the university, which is a campus-wide program. I'm also partially representing Dr. Natasha Turman, who couldn't make it today, who is the director of the Women in Science and Engineering Residence Program, which is our living learning community sister program to the overall WISE program.
Thank you. And so I, of course, am Maria, and I'm an epidemiologist, a professor here at the Ohio State University in our College of Public Health. And so I'd invite people in the audience to post questions in the chat. It would be great. We have a great, wonderful panel here, and so it would be great to be able to talk about some of your questions. But I'll start things off with a very general question. If the panel could just talk about what new programs have you generated on your campus to address these effects of COVID that we know have caused problems for undergrad students, undergrad women in STEM. So who would like to start us off?
I'm more than, oh, Jan, if you are ready, you can go first.
Okay. Well, most of our programs, I'm sorry. Most of our programs were modifications of things we were doing. But I would say the biggest change we had is to do a lot more, like with the mental health and that part of student support, that we traditionally thought of other parts of campus managing, but when it became very obvious that the online environment made that more difficult, we expanded a lot into that with even our social events added portions of that just to make everybody aware of best practices.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, so at the university, our WISE program, we're very lucky to have really great collaboration with Medtronic. So one new thing that we've done this fall to try and engage with students as well as utilize, so Medtronic also has a WISE initiative. So we do some really great collaboration. But one thing that we've done this fall is actually a bi-weekly, so every other week, discussion series with Medtronic professionals. So it could be anything from a WISE professional talking about her research that she's doing. We've done a TED Talk discussion about why it's important for women to be in STEM. We've also done panels regarding major exploration and graduate school. So we've definitely tried to be more engaged and offer a variety of opportunities. We do try to record them with the permission of the professional to share, but that is something that, you know, the frequency of these types of events are something that we haven't really done before, but really trying to utilize professionals who are super interested in engaging with students this fall, especially since so many of them are also working from home, that they just have so much more flexibility to engage with students, which is, without having to also think about travel, is just really nice.
I'll add, I mean, both of those, I feel like we didn't want to add new programming. That was the first thing. How do we add new programs to accommodate? And then we're like, oh, they're getting overwhelmed. So we tried to modify a lot more mentoring, a lot more, you know, a lot more one-on-one, a lot more small group mentoring, especially for our engineering students. We did we sent home a care package. So just fun from your home, having everything shipped and then boxed up and shipped out from my home was a fun challenge. But we did things like, you know, comm and tea time and painting. And so they had those supplies with them. And we built catapults from a kit and things like that. To kind of extend those activities we would have been doing on campus and building that community together. We did little things like movie nights and networking and study groups. And for the research community was so different because they weren't just home, so were their faculty advisors. So it was a challenge helping them coordinate schedules because they're all home with family, and you know, trying to coordinate lab meetings was really, really interesting. And we're going to try to do it again in the spring. So it was a nice trial period.
Here I can go. At the University of Michigan, we sent out a survey at the beginning of the year to our undergraduate students asking what kind of programming they'd like and if there's anything they wanted to change while they were remote. And I think a lot, like all of you said, overwhelmingly, they said they wanted more opportunities to socialize and to meet peers their own age, to meet professional potential mentors and professionals in their desired field. So we came up with exactly what all of you did. So we worked with some student groups to set up some professional development opportunities with local women from local companies that also acted as sort of recruitment events for the student body, because it's harder for those women in STEM clubs to get younger students in when they're not having big club fairs and so forth. We put on some social events as well, purely through WISE. Our biggest change is we started a book club, which was a wild success, and we're excited to do it again next year. We ended up doing it for incoming students because they weren't able to go to orientation. So it was kind of a fun WISE replica of the orientation experience, like meet some women who share your interests and you'll be ready to go when you get on campus. So we read a book about equity in STEM and racial justice. It was What the Eyes Don't See about the Flint water crisis. So it had a local flavor too for the University of Michigan. We had about 200 people attend. I have it written down right here. But yeah, it went great. And it was very different from what we usually do in the summer. So it was a really exciting transition.
These are some wonderful examples of ways of increasing the social fabric, the social cohesiveness of your group, and thinking proactively about how to do it. I'm curious if there were things that you found worked better than others, or for the things that worked, why do you think they worked? We know that students are burned out, and everyone's burned out on Zoom. And so we're asking them to come back on Zoom and participate again. And so what sort of components, what elements of these programs, this programming that you implemented, what do you think made it work?
Well, one quick one is, I think because so many professionals are working from home, we always have had companies that bring in people to do tech talk / social, and we were able to get higher ranking people who had really aspirational type jobs for our students that I don't think would have made the trip over to the university, and even from other coasts that we wouldn't fly somebody in for, but they were able to come in because they could come in by Zoom.
That's a wonderful point. So it was a lower ask, and you could ask bigger names because of that. Victoria, how did you get 200 people to join your book club? I'm in awe.
I finally found it. What did we have? We had 136, ending up being 201 people participating if you included staff and faculty. Yeah, we sent out an email to every incoming first year, just all 3,000 of them, which worked pretty well. It was interesting. We had about 300 students who were interested and about 100-ish first years who ended up participating. We sent out an email to every junior and senior asking if they wanted to facilitate book clubs. They were peer facilitated by upper class students, and the response was overwhelming. We had more people apply to be facilitators than to apply to be in the book club. It was wild. So the upper class students had this real need for these leadership opportunities, which was interesting and something we used moving forward. And yeah, I was very impressed. The programs we had that were the most successful met multiple needs at once. So I think this really crossed mentorship, networking, and STEM interest. The other programs that we had were really successful, harkens back to what Jan said, which is we have some popular annual programs every December about how to get into medical school. And we had way more people attend than we usually do because they don't have to walk through the snow to get there. So in the accessibility, just like the physical limitations of having to walk a mile to the hospital for these talks. Once it's on Zoom, it was so many, like 250 people came to that workshop about how to get into medical school. So yeah, crossover appeal and accessibility on Zoom.
So we heard that from the students. We heard from Arusha how she appreciated the online office hours. And so I'm hearing from you too, and as well as from Jan, like Zoom does offer the advantage of reducing some of those barriers, and that you don't have to make such an investment to join in. How about Sam or Nicole?
It's funny, I am Rushi's staff mentor here, so I've seen her quite a bit. Now I know, we know what each other's houses look like, but we also try to do, like you said, there's so much Zoom fatigue. So I would say, okay, I hate this, it's cold out, but like, would you go for a walk with me? I'll put on my headphones and, get some of those students who sometimes I would meet with multiple times in, a month. And I say, all right, if we're going to meet, let's go for a walk. Let's try to, engage a little fresh air, just trying to change things because there is so much. And like Victoria said, students would show up for things in mass when it's, med school, info session, and how to, increase your GPA and things like that. but we were finding it's a little bit harder to get them to do the community building stuff that comes more natural when you're in person. So we tried to focus that, and a way that we did lure a lot of students into like the research events was that, you know, we had to tailor it to them. This will be, you know, anyone participating, it will be pre-recorded. So you're in a comfortable environment. You can practice it multiple times. You're going to submit your absolute. And so we had, you know, 65 presenters and, you know, several hundred attendees. And then they could also view it at different times, and it becomes part of their portfolio, which is something we plan to continue to do even when we are live again doing these presentations. And we did market in a way of, you know, now you are a virtual scientist. You know, the world will go back one day in some fashion or form, but what can you do in the meantime? So we tried to tailor all of this to their needs now, and so that they're not missing out on a whole semester and now a whole year of experiences.
I'd like to echo some of the other points that our panelists made. Like Jan said, so much of it is being able to connect with professionals that we normally wouldn't have been able to bring to students. That's been a huge advantage. Being able to hear from researchers at different corporations and being able to say, please come talk about what you're doing. And normally they would be in the lab, but being able to grab them over like a lunch hour that's convenient for both them and students while they're working at home is a huge benefit of being on Zoom. Another thing similar to, we also sent out a survey at the beginning of the semester for students asking, you know, we're going to be virtual for a while. What are things that you want to see, or what would get you to join an event on Zoom after being in classes on Zoom, Zoom classes all day. We heard everything from book clubs to trivia to lunch discussions, especially for our first years. That's something that we've seen a huge struggle for our first years, is because many of them were not physically on campus this fall. That the transition from high school to college was very difficult in the sense of socialization, meeting other people. So offering opportunities where they could have like discussions and have like material. So that has been really helpful for students, to give them something beforehand and say, hey, read this article or watch this TED Talk, and then we're going to talk about it. And here are some questions that we're going to discuss. So they feel a little bit more prepared versus just saying, just show up. That is really nice. And I always let students know, if you don't have time to do it, that's totally okay. Like, feel free to come, and we're gonna be talking a lot about these things. Like, you don't need to watch this in order to join the conversation, because students are already so busy. I try not to give them additional homework for our events too.
If you don't mind if I follow up.
Please.
I wanted to say something about part of why the book club was successful, going back with getting higher profile speakers. I'd like to add, we managed to get the author of the book to come and answer all the students' questions, who is an internationally renowned scientist. She's the woman who broke the story of the Flint water crisis, the first person to measure the lead in the water. And she was, you know, immediately said yes. We're like, oh, is there any chance? And she was like, sure, what time? I'll do it from my bed. Which is an amazing opportunity that we would definitely not have had otherwise.
We had her come speak too in pre-COVID days in person, but I can imagine that, I can appreciate that it must have been a much easier ask for you to do through Zoom. Nicole already touched on this. Some think that you envision keeping some of this, but we have a question from Dean Litt in the comments. Do you plan on keeping any of the programs you've developed during COVID?
Absolutely. I think, especially for many, at least with our professionals, many of them seem to be that they will be working from home beyond even being in a pandemic, that they've realized that they can do a lot of their work from home for most of the week. So kind of utilizing that flexibility on their part. And I definitely think we'll keep some of it. Like, we did in October, November, we did a graduate like personal statement workshop And that was so helpful. We've done it in person before. It has not been very successful. We tripled our numbers having it on Zoom just because it was so much more convenient for students. So each senior could come in with their personal statement. They were paired one-on-one or even with two professionals to go through their personal statement and get tips or editing techniques or things that they should be including. And we just saw the numbers triple, which having it on Zoom, it was just so much more convenient for students versus having to truck across campus to meet with somebody, maybe meet with somebody for 30 minutes. So part of it was increasing the number of professionals who could volunteer, but also just the convenience of Zoom. So I think we'll continue to have it on Zoom because it is just so nice for them.
How about the others? Will you continue to send care packages in future years to your students?
I have to say they're very expensive. So that was a little bit tricky, but not as expensive now that I'm doing these media reports. The ROI wasn't as bad because we used to host events with, 200 students at a time, catering and silly things like karaoke and de-stress coloring, but we would do, these were expensive events. So it was kind of nice to have, an opt-in group. And so for our first round, we did 32 first years who hadn't had that experience before. So they didn't know what not to, they weren't disappointed. I hope. No, they're actually really, really great feedback, and they sent great pictures of the, launching stuff with their catapults, and we plan to use some of those supplies in the coming semester. So I really think it's a nice way. I know we've also done this in our my colleague did this for our arts community. So it was lovely to have supplies to go along with the guest speaker, and tie those things in. So there is an element that, yes, would be great to do, especially back on campus where someone could, collect all the packages and help me split up the supplies because my kids are too young to be helpful. But, things like that, we would love to continue. Definitely with the research program, I would love, and we plan to continue doing the virtual component. So we have, a published website each year, which is really quite ridiculously inexpensive compared to our, bound, program. And, we will still continue the event, but I think we could tailor this a way that meets both and is really way more accessible to, the community and the family and friends and those that want to engage in research, but couldn't make it that one night. So I think it really is going to open doors to like how we move in the future in these programs.
Thank you, Nicole. Jan?
We don't do anything with sending out care packages because we have 4,000 undergraduates, and I couldn't imagine doing that. But a couple of the things that we will definitely continue with, probably an online option, would be we have our tutoring and our mentoring programs, which converted to online virtual environment just fine. And I think some of the students did recognize that they were able to participate because of the lack of commuting and things like that. And so going to having both platforms isn't that much of a stretch once we're back in person. I would say one of the bigger ones is our outreach programs that we do, K-12 outreach. We've attracted students from all over the country to our outreach programs, where before it was parents dropping them off. And so it'll be really nice to see that. Our Girl Scout program and things like that have grown immensely. And even our lounge, we have what we call the DICE lounge, which is diversity and inclusion in computing education. And so it's a physical space, and that's where we put up announcements, and students come there to, hang out and things. But having the virtual space of that has shown many benefits. That we have, we have it set up as an ELMS class right now, or it's ELMS organization, so it's on Canvas, but we can put up announcements there, and it's almost an extension of their class structure, but they're some are much more active that would not necessarily have come over to the physical lounge, because we don't have space for 400 some students in our physical lounge.
So we're thinking about the programming. I'm going to shift a little bit and think about the needs that undergrad women of color might have. So we know that the pandemic has been harder in general on women of color. My city, my college, like many others, I mean, we're not unique, but we've declared racism to be a public health problem, a public health crisis. But just passing this hasn't really fixed anything. We know that because of racism, Black, Indigenous, people of color, they face higher risks of mortality and morbidity from COVID. There was a jobs report that came out last week, and it showed, many groups, subgroups holding steady, except that Latino women and Black women have lost jobs. So we know that women of color are facing these issues related to concerns about health, concerns about economics, finances, and we know that these are problems for students. And so I'd like to hear from the panel about whether you created anything specifically to address the challenges that Black and other women of color, undergrad women of color face.
I start. So I'm really lucky in the College of Science and Engineering that I have a really amazing coworker who is the Assistant Director of Diversity and Inclusion, and we do so much of our work together since we are both supporting underrepresented students and have so much crossover. Here in Minneapolis, we definitely, were affected by the tragedy of George Floyd's murder this past year, which was shocking and difficult for not just us as professionals, but also for our students. So much of our summer was really focused on hosting opportunities or hosting spaces for students of color to have like an open space just to share how they were feeling, especially how they were feeling about like responses from the college and the university. That was a huge thing. Our college also has a Diversity Inclusivity Alliance that we're both co-leads on, which is really meaningful to be able to talk about not just, what's good for the college, but also what policies are affecting students and along those things. So we actually lead a student grad and postdoc group, which is focused on elevating the voices of students to say, what barriers are you facing? What are areas that need to be improved upon? Our building is being renovated this upcoming year. What are things that you'd like to see in this building, such as like gender neutral restrooms or accessibility, building access? So a big thing for us this year has been allowing like discussion groups and discussion opportunities for them to really lead the charge on sharing what they want. And our job is to elevate their voices so that they get to the people that can approve those decisions. So we really try to focus on that. It's not us making these recommendations, that it's students who want these things, and you should be hearing from students about why these things are important to them. And if we're talking about systemic racism in the college or systemic racism in the state of Minnesota, those are important things that we need to be discussing, and that we can't shy away from those conversations. And it can be anything from student policies to what are your recruitment tactics for recruiting professors of color and faculty. So we talk about everything in those meetings.
We have the same type of, go ahead.
No, Jan, you were going to talk about what she said.
We have the same type of thing. We have a student advisory board, and because we have the AREBA initiative, which is for all diversity, and the Center for Women, we have like affinity groups and things like that, as the students have put it forth in our student advisory board for those organizations.
I was going to point out, we actually had a challenge on this front that I'd like to share. We co-sponsor the Graduate Women of Color Student Club, Muses, the movement of underrepresented sisters in engineering and science. It's a very popular and well-loved club, and we host something called the Flourish series the last few years, where once a month WISE co-hosts self-care and mental health programming with Muses. So usually something artistic, we do paint-alongs, or we do creative writing, and then guided discussions on mental health. I was looking at transitioning that program to undergraduate women of color because it was currently only graduate students, and realized there is no student group. There are none student groups for women of color in STEM at Michigan. So I talked to Muses. I was like, hey, maybe we could start one, just like an offshoot of Muses. Y'all could offer mentorship. We could transition the Flourish series. They were super into it. I was super into it. And no one came, literally no one. We tried very hard to recruit people to these events and it didn't work. So I don't know if the programs don't transition from graduate to undergraduate as well as I thought it would, or if the reason there wasn't already an undergraduate women of color in STEM club is because no one wanted one or that need would have been filled. I've actually still been working on why it wasn't successful, and I'm not sure.
Victoria, I really appreciate you sharing that because I'm reflecting on what our student organizations look like, and I don't think we do either. One thing I have experienced with our student groups is that we have like SWE, but then we also have NSBE, SHIP, ACEs. And so we see a lot of I tend to see a lot more of our women of color being involved with those student organizations versus one that's focused on just on women. And I think I say this as, as a woman of color who was in STEM, I feel like we get to see a lot more connected in relationship building with those identities versus and there's definitely overlap where like students will be involved with SWE, but I just don't see anything specifically for women of color. And I feel like maybe that's just finding an identity within SHIP or ACES and NSBE and finding a really great community there. And part of that too is just like how small the communities are within our college too.
Yeah, that's wonderful feedback. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
I think someone in the audience has their hand up. Do you want to ask your question? Or you can type it in the chat and I'll read it for you. And while you are typing it, let me go back and pick up on a thread. So we're talking, we've had several references to students' mental health, but we have a question in the chat that asks specifically though about this. So what sort of programming have you planned? What have you tried that has worked or maybe hasn't worked to address the mental health concerns of students?
I have to say, and Victoria, thank you for sharing, because there's a program that I would like forever to forget when one student showed up. But that is what happened when we try to address mental health concerns in a virtual setting in mass. It did not work for us on different platforms with different groups of students. They were like, no, I don't need to de-stress on Zoom. I don't want to talk about everything again. And so it was interesting that our engineering community, when we had decided, okay, we're going to do this event and we got no turnout, I was like, oh no, my heart's crushed. But me and my team decided, okay, we're going to reach out and say, hey, I have a couple of questions. How are you feeling about this? Like, I'm teaching from my bathroom, hoping the shower curtain looks like a wall. And, how are you doing? And what's your arrangement? And we ended up having, me personally, I had over 300 mentoring one-on-one meetings. That is 3 times as many as I would usually have in a semester. And I realized, okay, let's concentrate our efforts away from, trying to tackle mental health in that, large platform space. And we started doing just so much more one-on-one engagement and, hey, don't share your camera. Let's just talk. Like we created playlists and things like that to, share a little bit of ourselves without being, exposed. And it sharing a playlist through like a group chat was one of the most popular events we did, and it was awesome. Some of them loved 90s rap, and I was like, oh, okay, we're gonna be okay. And so we had like this wonderful moment of kind of peace and tranquility in this craziness. But I'm lucky to be at Rutgers, where we have, you know, so many resources and mindful meditation and, you know, real psychological support staff, or I can reach out to them, and they have tons of events. So what we did was try to really filter the mental health needs to those professionals in a way where they're used to doing this already. They've been doing it for a year, and really relying on them and trying just to get our students to the support they needed, and then being just being able to listen, and making that time for them to listen, which did mean a lot of like 8, 9 o'clock at night appointments, sometimes on the weekends. But, you know, I was like, okay, if I can get to this number, if I can see this many more students, you know, maybe this will get them through that next week or month. So I guess at some point we have to worry about our mental health. So I hope you are all spending time on that as well. But yeah, it was a very tricky place to be, being a non-health mental health professional put in this role. I'm sure y'all have experienced that.
I completely agree with Nicole about getting it in more subtly in some ways, you know, as in letting them know about the resources on campus when they happen to be there for something else, or in our TA training and in our mentorship prep program and things like that, to make sure, you know, you're not talking about what you might need, but what you might need when you're talking to somebody else, you know, and making it, I don't know, maybe that's sneaky, but it's a little just more subtle way of getting the information to them.
That's right. I'll pretend to be Natasha for a minute and talk about the WISE Residence Program. Natasha gave me some talking points, and she actually said exactly what you did. She did sneak attack mental health programming, where what she did was she'd bring women from industry and academia in to give career advice, because that had been a popular series they had done in previous years. But then she'd be like, but also talk about mental health. And she said it went great. So I think someone's talking about billing it as mental health can be a hard sell for undergraduates, but sliding it into other programming was an effective way to get the message out.
Sneak attack is much better than subtle, like I said.
Like that. It's almost like putting like the veggies and like hiding the veggies in food. You know, so we have done something similar for our students, especially since I'm one person and can't meet with each individual. I try as I might to meet with so many students, but can't all the time. So we have a couple mentorship opportunities that I'm in charge of. One of them is our, and I know I've mentioned Medtronic previously, but we actually have a Medtronic mentorship opportunity for any of our first year WISE students. So they are guaranteed, if they're in the WISE Living Learning community, they're guaranteed a professional mentor for their first year. Due to being on Zoom and the overwhelming number of professionals who were interested in doing it, we could definitely expand that this year. So we invited another Living Learning community that had women in it for engineering. We also have an undergraduate graduate mentorship, WISE mentorship, which I think this year we had about 60 undergraduates and 60 grad students that opted into this program. So anywhere from a first year to a senior. And we definitely provide mental health resources and some like identifier like training to all mentors, saying like, here are signs that you can be looking for mental health indicators, or if a student is in crisis, here are some really great resources. One, you can always reach out to me if you have concerns, but also here are resources that you can follow up with. And here we at the university have like a red folder that actually like hands out what the steps are and what resources are available. So we provide those to all of our mentors because they have such a really good one-on-one and meet so often virtually that they notice changes in behavior or habits or concerning language that's coming from students. So it's nice to kind of sneak it in there in the sense of having someone who's got that touch point, which is really, really helpful.
We have a comment from Christina Kaunziger in the chat. It looks like they also were able to sort of sneak it in by, and I guess another way of thinking about it is normalizing the need for mental health services by including it in their an ongoing support group class. So we know that students, we all recognize that students have different needs, and so can the panel talk a little bit about whether some of the programs worked well for some sets of students, but maybe not other subsets, and how did this differ? And did you notice any unique challenges specifically for women of color?
I have one. We had time to do quite a bit of evaluation this year of our programming. We were able to get really accurate attendance data when everything is on Zoom, and then use that to pull really accurate demographic data about our students that attended. One thing that was interesting to us is students who attended our programs had a much higher GPA to start with than our control group of students who didn't. So they both had a higher GPA at the time they took the program and a higher GPA at graduation than students who didn't participate in WISE, which would suggest that we attract high achieving students, which is interesting and an opportunity for growth into finding like middle or low achieving students in STEM to really work on STEM major attrition, as well as, I mean, it's great to attract high achieving students and then help them get to better placements in the world. So it was really interesting. We also found out that we have a higher proportion of women of color participating in our programs than the proportion at the university. So that was really exciting to find out.
I think something that was interesting was that I'm now placing our research scholars for a spring course that I teach through Douglas and Rutgers, and the applicant pool is more diverse. It's more diverse every year. We do great outreach, but it's more diverse, and the students are. We ask kind of those sneaky questions like, well, yeah, how did you hear about me? But who would you love to work with and why? And they're like, well, actually, I was at this, I attended this Zoom lecture I wouldn't have because our buses can take an hour to go 5 miles. Or, I was able to, Douglas did this a beautiful series on women in public health, which was so pertinent. And so they went through the newest, research and their experience. And they were, not only Douglas alums, but mainly women of color. So we had great representation. And like everyone was saying, we had women from, all over the country, which we wouldn't have been able to do in this format. So I think we were able to reach more of our population and definitely, increase some accessibility. But also with our Douglas course, we talk about, leadership, women's leadership and things like this, but we also talk about religion, our background, our family, our, the biases we bring every day. And so that is a whole different environment to be in. So we were very intentional on, quickly you noticed people stop sharing their camera and they stop sharing their background, and they can't talk about their home life and experience. They're in their home with their family. So it was a really unique experience for me. And to see, you can see disparities between, ethnic backgrounds when, really socioeconomical backgrounds when students who are in their, one bedroom that they share with no one else, or their parents' office, or they're able to go to a room where no one else is. And we would have students who have no privacy, have internet issues. My internet would drop, once or twice a week. So kind of combating those things is where you really start to see, students in their element and what they're facing that you wouldn't normally see when they're all on campus or commuting to campus. So I don't think I have any answers, but it was really interesting to be kind of a little bit a part of that, and meeting them where they are was really interesting.
So if we could go back a little bit, so we were talking about mental health. So can we circle back, and does anyone on the panel have any advice about how we might need to address this differently for different types of students according to, you know, their backgrounds, their cultures, their religions?
I can speak from personal experience. I'm really lucky that I get to work at my alma mater. So I was I was a STEM student. I was a biology major in college, and definitely faced some of my first had experience like anxiety and depression as an undergraduate student, or even as a high school student, but didn't identify that. Coming from a Hispanic, like Latinx family, you know, that's just not something that we talk about, at least in my family's culture, and from generation to generation. As an undergraduate student, I was really, really lucky that I had a mentor and someone who led my leadership program that I was in, who called me in for a meeting and just like had a really honest conversation with me about how was I doing, asked questions about, like, didn't say like you need help directly, but more was along the lines of, how are you feeling, and like what's going on at home, like, or even with family that lives out of state, and felt like it kind of all just like my walls just kind of all tumbled down. I don't have really great advice because each student is just going to be so different, but I think some of it is something I do with my students is really normalizing mental health, especially for being a person of color and talking about mental health, normalizing anything from therapy to talking to a doctor to medications. Normalization is a huge step up. I think sometimes the biggest step, because it feels very scary and daunting, talking about in the abstract, or like that's something that other people deal with. Like, I just have to manage on my own because that's the expectation. And also combined with imposter syndrome is also incredibly challenging. But yeah, even with my students talking about being in the pandemic and being like, you know, I've been in therapy before, and actually I'm going to start therapy again because being in a pandemic is really challenging, and I just need that additional space to talk and voice my thoughts and feelings and things that I'm scared about. And that's okay. And here's why that's okay. And being a resource for students to say, if you have any questions about what type of resources are available or what kind of people that you can talk to, let me know. I'm happy to have that, hold that space for you. So I can't say like based on religion or other things, but for me, and with my students, it's vocal and continued normalization of like mental health.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks. Yes, I would hope that we're all normalizing the importance of addressing issues, and that it's not a sign of weakness, and making it clear the resources that are available. And I'm so grateful also that you had somebody who recognized that you needed help. And I'm wondering if the panel has ideas about how we recognize those students during this time. In Zoom, it's really easy. I mean, it's hard. It's easy to misunderstand social cues. It's hard to understand what people are going through. How do we do this virtually? I would guess that many of us are very good at this in person, but when you're through Zoom, through this filter where you can't really pick up on the cues that you might have before. And so a student who's struggling, maybe mental health, maybe something else, they're struggling academically, they're struggling with a home issue. How do you have any suggestions, or have you found any ways of identifying those students who are struggling?
I think for me, now that you say that, I'm not sure. I don't have a list. I wish I did. I wish I could be like, this worked. But just what Sam says, everything Sam just said, I was like, yep, that's me. All of those things. Thank you so much. I, try to, and I always feel like, I know it with students, it really, really works. And it really crosses over that, like that's what becomes mentoring, more than here's your schedule. How can I help you plan your, timeline? But, students will talk about, well, my family's like this. And I was like, huh, that's funny. And a student said to me once, we were talking about something, just kind of silly and joking. And I was like, oh, my mom would say this. She goes, is your mother an Indian mother? And I go, oh, no. But like, it was so funny. We had the same mother. And, you find these shared experiences and they cross, sometimes these, boundaries we think that really separate us. So I think it's always good to share your road and share your experience with students. We're lucky at Douglas, we do this kind of welcome plenary for our course, which hosts most of our first year students. So, sometimes 500 to 700 students, and we stand in front of them and we tell them this story. And usually I make them cry and hopefully laugh, but it's my story and I try to own it. And I will get emails throughout the year, if not the next year, to say, you know what, you said this about, finally saying, I need to go talk to somebody, or I need to figure this out. And, trying to be open in that platform. I didn't think it would work this past September. I'm outside trying to, share my life to a blank screen, which is very awkward. And you're like, oh God, what if they're not laughing? What if they're not like enjoying my time? And like, I really saw a really good spike in the return of student comments and reaching out for mentoring appointments. So I think it's harder. It's so tricky to kind of navigate. But, kind of putting yourself out there, and it's awkward for us because we haven't necessarily had to do this before, but also being able to recognize that student in an email that might have a curt response that didn't before. It's like you're being sneaky, but you're like, are you busy? Are you tired? Or is there something wrong? Because we have family who are losing family members, that are actually sick, and they don't necessarily report that to you as a program director. They might be reporting that to classes, and sadly students are getting lost in the shuffle. That is these where we all are at our institutions. So it's just kind of trying to be able to share at that level that you used to, and trying to normalize it as much as you can. And I joke about it a lot, about teaching from my bathroom. But, then they're like, oh, it's okay, I'm in the garage, or I'm in my car. And I love seeing you, Victoria, in your car. That's like, yep, safest place ever to be. But I think that's it, making it normalized, making them see you as a human, even though they may not have met you before, which is really awkward.
One of the things Nicole said that sort of slipped in, but I want to emphasize it, is the variety of ways of communication that she said about emails and one-on-one and group activities, and, even getting information from the professors if somebody, has completely changed in what their performance is and things like that. All of these, different ways for different people, I think is really important, because some people you'll be able to notice certain characteristics using one method and some using another method, but also the way they're comfortable asking for help or even verbalizing how they're feeling is very different. So we use Slack a lot, we use Elms, we use small group meetings, all different types of communication platforms.
So everyone has obviously had to pivot and think about how you're often programming differently. So can you talk a little bit about how you've evaluated this? Have you had to evaluate it any differently in terms of what programming is successful?
Absolutely. I cannot compare what in-person attendance looks like compared to Zoom attendance. We often look at things like how many students pre-registered and then how many actually came. I just have had to reevaluate. Like, I don't take it personally anymore. I think the first time we held a Zoom event was like 30% of the people that registered came, and just realizing things happen. Zoom fatigue hits people at all different times. You could pre-register for something a week ahead of time, and then the day of comes along and we have to adapt. So success for me is getting, like, hearing from students after an event or even at the end of an event saying, are you going to host this again? When's the next thing? Just that verbal confirmation from students. We did a virtual physics tutoring session for first years, and I have had multiple students who come to every single one of them, but I have one student who consistently at the end says, when is the next one? This has been so helpful. Here's why it's helpful. Thank you so much. And just that confirmation for me is like, okay, this is something that we need to continue doing. And a big part of it is just, what do our attendance numbers look like? And if we can get like 40% of people who pre-register to actually come, that's amazing to me. And we've gotten better for some events, not as great for others. But I just can't compare it the same way. Like, I just have to kind of throw that out the window.
Luckily, we don't have to order food for virtual events, because if only 30% came when you ordered food, it's a much bigger problem.
I'll take myself off mute. I want to make sure that we address a question that is in the comments. We have a few minutes left. So does anyone on the panel want to talk about, what do we know about the evidence about how to address including groups together versus separating out to learn about issues facing that women of color particularly face?
My answer to that is somewhat the same as the previous one. It's variety, because like we were saying, some women of color more identify with the affinity groups for people of color and others with the affinity groups for women. And you have to have a variety of options, because different people need different, levels of affinity groups.
So can you talk maybe a little bit about what, if you have a caucus, so in my college, we've had caucuses just for students of color to come together when we were, going through the BLM protest during the summer, when, we had a shooting of a tragic shooting of someone by a police officer. So during these times, we've had a separate caucus for students of color to come together. And I'm wondering if anyone on the panel can share, what would be important that students would get out of this that they might not get out if you brought everyone together? Because in some ways it seems good. Why wouldn't we want to bring everyone together? But in other, but we can also imagine that there might be a value in pulling people separately.
Thank you. And that's actually what I was going to touch on. We actually had an event this past summer after George Floyd's murder. And we had a space for all students, and then we transitioned to having a space just for students of color. A big part of that was that we found it, and we've tried both, and there's pros and cons to having both spaces. But I do have to say, when we had students all together, students of color were opting out in the middle of the event just because white students, I will say, were kind of dominating the space about how shocked they were, how could this happen? And students of color were very much in the sense of, this is our reality, this is not shocking to us, this is our lived experience, and often being tokenized in those spaces as well, in the sense of, well, how do you feel, or what do you think? And they don't want to be, and I'll say this as even myself, I feel like students of colors need space just to express their emotions without being a learning opportunity. That we need spaces where we can be ourselves and aren't code switching and aren't kind of babying other people or making people feel better about themselves. Sometimes we need space just to mourn and to be angry without feeling that we are hurting people's feelings. Like, I think that's important. There's definitely opportunities, and I really focus on hosting opportunities for students to talk about intersection of gender and race. We did a book club about great book. If you haven't read it, I actually have it here. It's A Good Time for the Truth. It's specifically about race in Minnesota. It's a series of essays and stories, and talked about what race looks like in Minnesota, which is so predominantly white, but also culturally diverse. But yeah, I have to say that sometimes I feel like students of color need that space, especially women of color need that space to be themselves and not be a learning opportunity for others.
Thank you, Sam. We're ending on such an important topic, and I hate to end, and I hope everyone will stick around for the networking session. There will be a link in the chat. I'm going to turn things over to Dean Litt to orient us to the next stage. Thank you, panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to the panel. That was great. And oops, and yes, I think you all generated very important ideas and challenges. And this last issue, I think, is really crucial. And I'm glad that we had at least some time to flesh that out. I know at Douglas, it's something that we talk about quite a lot.